Hello, welcome back to my channel. My name is Charlotte and this is Charlotteshelves. In today's video, I wanted to bring you my 10 best books of 2025. I had 18 5-star reads this year, which feels quite a lot for me. I don't tend to give out 5 stars very often because I think a book has to be unique, it has to be exceptional, and it has to be a powerful reading experience. As of recording this video, I read a total of 75 books in 2025. I also want to give you a slight trigger warning because 3 of my top 10 books are to do with the subject matter to do with true crime really, and historical events, and 1 or 2 atrocities. So there will be a lot of trigger warnings coming up in this video, so I just wanted to give you a heads up because I did read some dark subject matter this year, as you will see. I have 7 of my top 10 books here and 3 were on Kindle. So let's start. Number 10 is Falling by TJ Newman. I don't want to give too much away about this book, so I'm just going to quickly read you a couple of lines from the blurb and then we can discuss. You just boarded a flight to New York. There are 143 passengers on board. What you don't know is that 30 minutes before the flight, your pilot's family was kidnapped, and for his family to live, everyone on your plane must die. The only way the family will survive is if the pilot follows his orders and crashes the plane. Enjoy the flight. This was one of the most fast-paced thrillers I have ever read. I was compelled right from the beginning. It cut straight to the action and I was hooked. It was the perfect blend of a lighter-hearted plot with a breakneck pacing and narrative style. It was plot-driven but low effort on my brain. It was very straightforward, easy to read writing style, which I very much enjoyed. And this plot is told from multiple narrative perspectives. So although you have the pilot in the cockpit and those sorts of events unfolding, you also get perspectives from the FBI, passengers, other terrorists, people involved in this incident. And that intersperses the plot line to where the action is happening, and it builds that pacing and that tension because I was plowing through the chapters that weren't the pilot, trying to work out what he was going to do. Was he going to be able to escape? Was he going to have to crash the plane? It really built this sense of tension. I really enjoyed the way this staggered the tension and the plot, and it made for a very compulsive reading experience. This is very much a big American blockbuster action style of a book, and I really enjoyed it. It's light-hearted, it's not too gritty or upsetting. This book has so many twists and turns and your tummy will just be doing somersaults while you're reading it, and this is one of the top 10 books of this year. Book number 9 is The Body Keeps the Score, Mind, Brain and Body in the Transformation of Trauma by Bessel van der Kolk. I did speak about this in one of my previous videos, so I won't go into too much detail, but this book is a non-fiction work that explores the history of trauma and how people study and treat the brain and mental health, but also about how trauma is expressed physically in the body. It's as much a history about Bessel's own education and development and his career in this sector and this field, but also about the history of psychology. And this book draws on both Bessel's clinical experience and as a neuroscientist and as a therapist, and it kind of melds his own understanding, and you're taught that as well as a reader. He shares his research and his experiences and gives very practical case examples of patients that he's worked with, which can make for quite a triggering read. Like, this is quite a heavy going book. It deals with obviously people who have been abused in a myriad of ways and every single type of trauma that our brains and bodies and selves can sustain. And this book is fascinating because it also shows what the impact that trauma can have on our brains and our physical selves. And then it also towards the latter third of it starts to talk more about different types of treatment that are available, including more holistic practices, including not just talk therapy but EMDR and CBT and yoga and lots of these other fascinating things that can attest to how people can slowly try to heal their trauma. So much of this book is focusing on how to bring people back to themselves, how to find safety again, how to find connection, and how to not be defined by your trauma. This work did give me a really good understanding of trauma, which was something I didn't have before, and I found the history aspect of this quite enriching to learn about this industry because it's something I know nothing about. I had no idea there were so many different methods and modalities of treatment and healing, and not all of them, you know, were just medicine or strictly therapy based. There's so much more you can do for your mental health other than just those 2 things. And I would say this book also gave me a renewed appreciation for the essentialism of taking care of one's mental health. There is so much that I learned from this book. It could be an entirely separate video. There is so much knowledge in here, and I didn't expect to find it as interesting or as useful as I did. It was just such a surprising read, and this is why it's in my top 10. The next book I read has a lot of trigger warnings. It is Chernobyl by Serhiy Plokhy, and this is about the nuclear disaster that happened in Chernobyl. It's incredible, well-researched non-fiction work I've read in, I think ever. It really deserves to be in my top 10. A really brief overview of the events that occurred were that this disaster happened in Pripyat, which is in what is now the Ukraine, formerly when it was part of the Soviet Union, and it happened in 1986, and it's largely been regarded as one of the worst nuclear disasters of all time. A reactor within the plant exploded, which is a really simple way to kind of describe a trifecta, or not even a trifecta, a multitude of issues that led to this accident happening. This book not only explores the tragedy, but the wider context of what happened, the particular part of history that these events are located in, and also really unflinchingly looks at the aftermath of this disaster and those that suffered as a result. This book highlights a really intense combination of factors. There were fundamental flaws in the reactor's design, there was a lack of training for staff, there were safety protocols that were overridden or not adhered to at all, there were poorly planned experiments, there were money issues. This project was just riddled with issues even in its inception, as it was being created, as this plant was being developed. It seems to suggest that there was a deeply ingrained failure of safety culture within the Soviet Union's nuclear program, and it's quite stressful to read about because you're reading this thinking this is nuclear technology that you're working with, you know, not something far more simple. And this event is set against a fascinating backdrop of this particular part of Soviet history, and it also exposes these alarming issues that I've already kind of mentioned, and also the issues within the Soviet Union, because they had sort of a disconnect between some of the hierarchical powers and the structure and how plants were managed and how information was communicated between the highers and the lowers, and all of this ultimately did culminate in the disaster. And the book is equal parts fascinating as it is harrowing. I did have to read some parts of it in fragments because it was upsetting. Like I said, it really does share the scope of the devastation that happened. There are very graphic details to do with radiation sickness and the body count, and it is staggering and sobering to read. When the reactor blew up and these fires started, it literally blew the roof open on the reactor building so that the radiation from the rods in the plant were just being emitted straight up into the atmosphere. And it talks about the dangers of all of this, and I put this book in my top 10 because not only was it fascinating, it was just such a comprehensive account of what occurred. I have seen a couple of documentaries, and I think a lot of us have watched that incredible HBO dramatization that came out a few years ago, which is I think just called Chernobyl. But it really helps build your understanding of this catastrophe if you're interested in it, but it does not shy away from the very brutal reality and the suffering of those who were involved, just the general population, the staff, the brave servicemen and women who gave their lives and paid this ultimate price to try and fix and contain and protect this plant, to stop the radiation leaking any further. And it depicts all of this in, unflinching is the word I keep using because it's so raw to read about, and it's an incredible book, and I would recommend it if that's your cup of tea, but I appreciate this is such a distressing subject matter and it might not be for everybody. The next book I have is so much more jolly. This is Philip Larkin's collected poetry. I think Larkin is one of the greatest poets of all time, and this is the first time I think I'd read his entire works, because at the back of it, it's got a number of poetries and pieces that, it's got a number of poems at the back of it that haven't been previously collected in his other collections. So I really loved rereading all of these, plus some of the newer pieces that I hadn't read before. Larkin is a 20th century English poet who is largely known for his very dark, existential, almost depressing style of writing, and I fell in love with him when I was about 16, 17. I was quite an angsty teenager, and I hadn't come across a poet yet who had kind of tapped into that darkness but with a sort of modernity in his style of writing, and something about it just hooked me. These were some of the first poems that I'd ever read about atheism and death and some really dark subject matter, and they petrified me and awed me in equal measure. I was impressed as much as I was distressed. Larkin's works can often be bleak, but they were fascinating because of the the beautiful way that he depicts said bleakness, and he covers themes that are to do with time and mortality and death and how things change between generations, and his cynicism for the future, atheism, but also he captures this dread and that paralyzing fear of the inevitability of death. And sometimes there's a sense of futility of our actions or our existence, and they capture these varying moods of frustration and anger and bitterness and apathy. He can also be quite biting in his criticism of certain institutions like religion and marriage. I really loved rereading this, and I think there's something very special about sitting with one particular poet's works and just going through all of them and taking the time to reread them and annotate them. It was such a rich experience. The poems that I really love by him are The Old Fools, Home is So Sad, High Windows, Obeyed, I think it's one called Water, that's lovely. But I would highly recommend Heads in a Women's Ward is probably in my top 3. I find the starkness and the language and the imagery used in that really powerful and also scary. Where are we? Book number 6. This is Strange Sally Diamond by Liz Nugent. This is another incredible thriller book. The story broadly focuses on Sally, who is an adult, but she has largely lived an isolated life with only her father. When her father suddenly dies, Sally is kind of thrust into public life and society again, and the novel charts her unease. Sally kind of reads as a character who is potentially neurodivergent or has some additional needs. It charts her awkwardness and her discomfort with the modern world, and we also start to learn some dark reasons and dark secrets as to why her dad has kept her and himself removed from society. We start to learn about Sally's personal history, about members of her family, people she meets in her village, in her town, and some really creepy things start to come out. This unfolds very gently, very slowly. Whereas Falling is fast-paced, this is much more of a slow burn, and we learn that one of the main things this book teaches you is the shocking capacity that abuse has to fester and be passed on through generations. So this is kind of about the legacy of trauma and abuse. I would say this is one of the darkest and most intense fiction works that I've read in a really long time, and if not maybe ever. It can be violent and distressing, and this is another one that has a lot of trigger warnings. The main overarching theme of this, I would say, is those echoes of abuse, but also generational trauma, so much so that I would almost say that trauma is like a third silent character in this novel. The presence of it is so heavy regardless of which character or plotline you're following, which brings me to say that this book is told again through multiple viewpoints via a multi-stranded narrative and across different non-linear timelines. So you are trying to piece things together very slowly as you're told multiple different stories at the same time. This really helps create a strong sense of mystery and enigma, but at times things feel unclear, like it's kind of frustrating trying to see through the murkiness of what's going on. Can we trust our narrators in this book? What are they trying to say to us? What is not being said? Like what is by omission being missed out? And the reveals are told with a lot of restraint, and that makes it more shocking and kind of delicious when certain things are revealed to us, even if they are horrifying. This is as much a horror as it is a thriller and a crime thriller, and you also feel like you are a sort of detective trying to piece things together as you go as part of your reading experience. This book made me feel upset and uneasy, but I couldn't put it down. It is quiet but gritty, and again I'm going to keep using the word, but it is compelling. It's a novel that smoulders and it burns, and it reminds me in some ways of what I experience when I read a lot of Stephen King, is that these books have an aftermath or an afterlife. They get under your skin and you have this sort of recoil or aftershock after you finish it of like, what did I just read? And it is a book that stings and it stays with you. It would be in my top 5 thrillers of all time. Yeah, highly recommend. Book number 5 is finally something that isn't harrowing, distressing or upsetting, I promise. This is short and sweet, 101 very short poems by Simon Armitage. This was a book I'd read in uni and was a reread, but I hadn't reread it in maybe 10 years or so. My copy got lost or damaged and my friend re-gifted a copy to me this year, so I was delighted to reread it. It was such a nostalgic experience because we were given this as reading material before I started my first English degree, and this just captures a chunk of my life in which I was trying to read and absorb, and I discovered so many incredible poets that I love to this day through this work. There's a really beautiful Anne Bradstreet sonnet in here that I have loved forever and ever. She was new to me at that time. Also James Fenton. When I was a teenager, I obviously hadn't read any Emily Bronte yet or Stephen Crane. It introduced me to Sylvia Plath and A.E. Housman. This little collection is small but mighty. You can probably see how much I've tagged, because this was such a wonderful introduction to so many incredible poets. It really is gorgeous, and I think if you have a very short attention span as well, like I sometimes struggle with my attention span, this was a really great introductory way to love and learn more about poetry, but in smaller bite-sized chunks and smaller pieces that made me feel like I could easily dip in and out of it, and as a result I stuck with it so much more. Like, there is definitely something to be said about the power of the written word when it's in such an economical use of form. These are such small but powerful and potent pieces in here, and I think this is also a really great way to start to learn or read more or meet other poets' works. I thought this was incredible, and it was just such a solid 5 stars, and like I said, I really loved the nostalgia of going back and rereading this. Book number 4 is You Could Do Something Amazing With Your Life, You Are Raoul Moat by Andrew Hankinson. This book is difficult to talk about because, again, it's another distressing subject matter. The review that I originally wrote of this, I wrote that this is an exhausting and profound work. It is both overwhelming and upsetting as it insidiously creeps into your brain, disturbs and unsettles, leaving you feel wrought and depleted after reading. I would also recommend reading the Raoul Moat tapes documentaries on YouTube, as this makes you appreciate the writing style and the voice the author uses. Somehow he manages to capture Moat's rambling, convincing and distressingly unwell paranoia, including the cadence and accent of his speech. It is uncanny. So Moat, who this book is about, is from Northumberland, so he's got a slight northern accent and a northern way of speaking, like his cadence and the way that he talks, and some of that tone and style is captured in the speech in this novel. This book is about the life and crimes of Raoul Moat and his subsequent killing spree from 2010 in Northumberland. It was an event that was massive in the English media. It is very rare for us to have manhunts, especially gun-related crime type ones as well, and to also have multiple homicides or victims in an attack like this. They're just not that common in the UK. Moat also managed to avoid capture for 6 days, and the book is told across those 6 days when he was on the run. It kind of runs a dual narrative because you're also learning about Moat and his personal history, and that is kind of run alongside the crimes and the killing spree that he's also on. When you're learning about his backstory, it doesn't necessarily evoke empathy, but it kind of provides a measure of understanding for how he came to be where he is at this point in this incident that's occurring, like at this moment in the crime. It also gently critiques his own toxic masculinity. It looks at some of the factors that fed into his mental health and perhaps how certain health services failed him, how there were underlying undiagnosed psychological factors at play, but there were a number of ingredients that led to this kind of festering, boiling, this maelstrom of things that went wrong that led to this outburst of violent activity. It is an incredibly unique book because you are placed very viscerally behind the eyes of the killer, and you're in his mindset, his reasoning, and it's told in chapters that also detail how many minutes of life people have left. So as these sort of dwindle down, you know a certain big event is going to happen or something is going to go on, and that really creates this intensity to it, which is unsettling, and it's distressing because although this is a partially fictionalized account of what happens, it really gets into the head of Moat. You feel like you're behind his eyes. That fictionalized aspect of it means that you get this really powerful emotional resonance, which I don't feel a lot of the time when I read non-fiction true crime works, because this kind of blends the genre. It's got a lot more emotional pull, and where the boundaries between fiction and non-fiction are blurred, there's a sort of poetry to the writing and the style. And after reading this, I did go on a bit of a YouTube spree watching documentaries about him and more about the events that happened, and this work is, I would say, a very faithful adaptation to the truth of the instances and his character. Book number 3 is On Writing, a memoir of the craft by Stephen King. I read this on Kindle during a Stephen King readathon, and this was astounding. I loved it so much, and it was very enjoyable compared to some of the other books I've mentioned so far. I didn't know what to expect going in, but it wasn't what I expected. This book kind of straddles 3 genres, so as much as it is an autobiography, it feels like a hybrid non-fiction instrumental kind of guide for how to write and creative writing guidance, but there's also a lot of meditation and reflection on the art of writing and criticism of writing. So there's a touch of sort of literary criticism and theory within King's own writing and musings. Like, he's very self-reflective on style and art, and he gives so much information about how he approaches his own writing. For me, there was a lot of didacticism and really practical examples of what Stephen King has learned, and it was frank, it was very down to earth. It was like he was really trying to level with the reader, like get straight to it. This is how I approach my writing. It was very sincere and it was honest. I found there were quite a lot of raw emotive things that he shared about his past, his history of addiction, his family members. Like, so much of this book is also a sort of love letter to his wife. He talks about her with adoration, which is beautiful, and they've had a very long, successful marriage. He talks quite frankly about that. It surprised me how much he shared about himself in a way that I don't know if I could do that if I ever wrote a biography. So you get this really wonderful insight into Stephen King as a person, not the near mythic kind of horror god, and I think it helped humanize him for me, because in my brain he's quite high up on a sort of literary pedestal, and he is very elevated to me. And he also the latter third of it, also, I would say, is when he talks about this really terrible accident he is in which a driver hit him while he was going for a walk, and he talks about his connection to writing, how writing and his art is so interconnected to his life, but also ultimately about how his return to writing is kind of what motivated him to get better, to help him heal, and saw him get through this really difficult time of his life and his recovery. And it's just fascinating. And I think it isn't just about his fascinating rags to riches tale about how he was trying to provide for his wife and young family and how he became to be what he is. It seems like there's an earnestness to really share how to be a good writer, and it was joyful. I actually really appreciated that, and his sense of humour really shines through, which I hadn't necessarily learned about him as a person. And the humour in this as well is really fun. So this was, yeah, in my top 3 books of the year. My number 2 book of the year is a poetry anthology, and this is a new to me collection of books called The Poetry Pharmacy, and this is book number 2 called The Poetry Pharmacy Returns, and it says More Prescriptions for Courage, Healing and Hope by William Sieghart. My copy got eaten by my puppy when he was little, and at the time I felt sad because I just bought this and it's a nice little hardback, and my other half said to me, there will be a time when he's not a puppy and a baby anymore, and whenever you look at this book and you see his tiny little puppy teeth, is that going to focus? His little puppy teeth indentations, you will be reminded of a time where he was just a little baby fluff ball. So you should keep it and not throw it away, and I'm so glad I didn't, because I look at it now and I remember exactly where I was when I was reading it, how old my little dog was, and these tiny little needle puppy teeth. But William Sieghart does this, I think it's a podcast series and then in-person series, where people present him with problems or ailments or a condition, and he prescribes a piece of poetry like a tonic or a balm or a medication. And I love that pairing of it. I love the practicality of using poetry to help heal or soothe or uplift, and that's what this book is. And the choices of poetry, lots of them were new to me, which is wonderful to learn and read more, but also Sieghart's writing style. So each poem is accompanied with a small essay or piece by him. It tells you what the ailment is and then his method or reasoning for why he chose this. And he is just such an emotionally intelligent human being. The way he writes with compassion and empathy and kindness, it's so many pieces in him made me tear up, because he does deal with some heavy emotions and heavier problems like grief and pain, but also love and passion. And this is wonderful, and especially the poems, there are some that are to do with courage as well. It's just glorious, and I really fell in love with his writing style as much as I was approaching this hoping to read more types of poetry. His little essays and things that accompany them are just phenomenal. It's such an uplifting book to read. This would be a book I would happily buy and repurchase for all of my friends to share and talk about, because it's just phenomenal. It was really tough to either make this number 1 this year or the next one, which I've got coming up, but this was just wonderful. I love it. I'm probably not saying very much that's useful because I just keep looking at it and smiling. The final book I have, I read on Kindle. This was my number 1 book of the year, and this is called Homegrown, Timothy McVeigh and the Rise of Right-Wing Terrorism by Jeffrey Toobin. This is a book that traces Timothy McVeigh, who committed, I think, the largest act of domestic terrorism on American soil. It charts the events of the Oklahoma bombing, because McVeigh didn't exist in a bubble. He was a product of certain events that were going on in America, political events, and it talks about how his beliefs were shaped by sort of paranoia, conspiracy theories, white supremacist ideals. There's also an incredible Oklahoma documentary on Netflix, which is what turned me to reading this book, because like the documentary, it also shows there was a catalyst build-up of events in America that led to McVeigh committing this act. You may already be familiar with certain events to do with the Ruby Ridge standoff, to do with Randy Weaver. There was also the cult of the Branch Davidians in Texas in Waco and what happened there, and then McVeigh, and they are all kind of interconnected between how these three sort of historic events happened, because those previous two events were seen as examples where there was overreach by the government, and nothing fuels the alt-right faster, this book kind of seems to suggest, than feeling like the government is overstepping itself and the personal liberties and freedoms of the American people. And a lot of the conspiracy theories that this book explores shows how certain events tap into the paranoia of people on the alt-right, and it shows quite a disturbing analysis of how extreme ideologies can grow and what happens when they reach their absolute worst. And that is how we come to understand these events and this, what he calls homegrown terrorism. The book also shows that there were failures by the government and various intelligence agencies across multiple events, not the previous two that I also mentioned and the Oklahoma bombing. It shows how things went wrong in the intelligence sector and their agencies, and it also kind of shows it does show the manhunt of how they eventually captured McVeigh and his conspirators. And there's a lot of podcast series on this, and like I said, there's also Netflix series, but I felt like this book was the most comprehensive document that kind of corralled all this information about multiple historic events and strung them all together in a way that made it seem cohesive and understandable, to kind of show how people can be influenced into extremism, which to me always seems unfathomable, like how people can end up committing those acts. And that's why it's my number one book. It's difficult to talk about books that are about horrible things and express them in a way that shows enjoyment, because I think that can seem insensitive, and that isn't at all. Like, what they went through, I'm really not trying to rub a neck on. I just find American history fascinating, and I also find learning more about intelligence agencies and about extremism and how people commit these sorts of things, it's just so far beyond my realm of understanding or experience, and yet there has to be a reason why it happens. And I hope that kind of makes sense as to try and understand why I enjoyed reading this and also what made me want to read it. There's not necessarily a neat way to tie up talking about that because it's such an upsetting book, but that was my number one read of the year. Thank you for spending some time with me today. I was not expecting so much of my top 10 to be non-fiction and to be non-fiction related to truly horrible, awful things. I've also spent a good chunk of this year reading some really beautiful poetry and discovering some new poets, and that's been a sort of dichotomy between what I like to read. And these were the 10 best books that I read in 2025. I'm really grateful that I could share some of these books with you today. Please let me know if you have read any of them, and if so, what did you think? Are there any that you would like to add to your TBR? And are there any that you think, I am just gonna stay really far away from that, stay clear of that, that is not for me? If you haven't already, please do like, comment and subscribe, and happy reading.